be like without a legal system. Without a legal system, there would be anarchy. Our entire society would essentially be survival of the fittest, and I think we can agree that this isn't something we want. Specifically, I would contend that one of the major parts of the modern legal system is to protect people who are not necessarily the fittest. We provide worker protections against large corporations and provide schools for people who can't afford them. We take these things for granted, but without a system of governance which stems from a set of laws, this would not exist. While I do not think that one can argue that any legal system is perfect and void of unjust laws, I do think you can argue that people would be better off with some protections as opposed to none at all. So now that I've discussed why a legal system is important, I want to move on to why the duty to obey is a big part of this system. So without an obligation to obey the law, people won't really have an incentive to obey the law as such. One can argue that people will obey the law except in extreme circumstances, which is easy for us to say now, living in a society where we do have a legal system. But if people grow up in an environment where there is no obligation to obey the law, people would lose this reasonably inherent propensity to obey rather than disobey. Without a perception of the law that takes on a moral or obligatory character, people would start to see things in purely economic terms. As long as one thing provides less harm than good, it would not matter whether something is unjust. One can argue that this will not happen, but what will guide them if not the law? People generally have reasonably short memories, and it would be all too easy to let doing the right thing fall away if one gets benefit from doing something different. So that sort of deals with general stuff. But then what about the extreme circumstances, which is probably what our opposition is going to focus on? The question here is then going to be whether or not a line can be drawn where laws are unjust and therefore not worth obeying. I would contend that there is not a line that can be agreed upon. The father of a rape victim is going to think anything and everything is justified for his daughter's attacker, whereas most of the rest of society will impose limits on what is cruel and unusual. Furthermore, even if a line can be agreed upon, one must still consider the harm that not obeying the law can cause. One could argue that only civil disobediences along the lines of Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be allowed, but not every dissenter is going to be principled and nonviolent. Therefore, the only way to regulate this would be through another set of laws controlling civil disobedience, which someone could then disagree with and object to, which sort of leads to sort of a circular argument of having problems with the law. Finally, I think the one thing that could be used in sort of as opposed to a legal obligation would be a set of police state, essentially, where laws are so stringent that people would never disobey the law out of being scared. While this is one possibility, I think an imperfect legal system based on the duty to obey is still a better choice than this police state. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'm going to focus on addressing mainly the point of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience tends to be an argument used a lot by the people that do not agree that following the law is an absolute. And here I'm going to point out some points of why this is not the case. Even if there's many examples, great examples, where civil disobedience has triumphed and rid of many evils, for example, Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, or even if there are many examples where civil disobedience might have been really helpful for society, such as Stalin's Russia or the Nazi Party, we have to think about a very important flaw in this argument. That, for example, the Nazi Party was actually founded on civil disobedience. There was a government in Germany, and a person named Adolf Hitler, as you all should know, took advantage of the situation where a lot of people were discontent with the current government and the current situation in the country. He saw this opportunity and he took it. He made demonstrations, he made speeches, he was in jail where he wrote Mein Kampf, and all of this time he took advantage of what people perceived as unjust. People were mad because they had to pay the Versailles money. So he took advantage of an unjust, what people deemed unjust, and he went outside the law and created one of the most horrifying governments ever. So, for example, this leads to a problem. Who decides when civil disobedience is correct and when should it be applied? This is a practically impossible situation. When is it okay to break the law and when is it okay not to break, and even if it had some positive consequences or even if it had some negative consequences, that is dealt with afterwards. At that moment, how should you deem it correct or not? If it's outside the law, it's outside the law. So sadly, the only way to do this is going through the proper legal channels. You need to there is a need to pressure the government through its instances without stepping outside the law. A big problem with civil disobedience is even if this demonstration is peaceful, that doesn't mean that the response of the government is going to be peaceful. Even if the people are just standing on the street, doesn't mean that the police are not going to use this as an excuse to go and beat them up. So that's a very important consideration. You need to take the safety of the people demonstrating into account. So, in conclusion, the problem is what justifies civil disobedience and who determines it. That is a problem. And when you start breaking the laws, when do you draw the line? Because what is just and what is unjust is a very, very relative term. People have different opinions. And when is it, if a person disagrees very strongly against the law, even if every bone on his fiber disagrees with it, but the rest of society agrees with it, does that give him the right to disobey the law because he morally and believes that that is incorrect? If every person did that, we would have utter chaos in this society. So the only way I'm not saying that there are no unjust laws and that you shouldn't challenge them, but you should challenge them through the proper channels. By not doing so, you are opening yourself to anarchy and chaos. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, my name is Evan Austin, and I'll be arguing against an absolute obligation to obey the law. I'm going to make 4 points. We don't owe a debt of gratitude to the government, that the fairness doctrine isn't valid. Act utility shows that there's no obligation to obey the law, and rule utilitarianism does not imply that our society will fall into a state of anarchy without this absolute obligation. So first, in regard to gratitude, we don't ask for many services of the state, but rather receive them involuntarily. And furthermore, the government doesn't distribute benefits equally. So I want to imply a metaphorical example here. Imagine the government is your parents and citizens are siblings. So if your parents have given your sister more presents every holiday, they treat her preferentially, they feed her better, etc., would you then have to have the same debt of gratitude to your parents that your sister, who they treated better, should have? I think not. And in the same way, certain special interests benefit more from the actions of the state, yet an absolute obligation to obey is uniform and requires equal obedience from every citizen. So an even obligation to obey the law based on uneven debts of gratitude to the government is inherently unfair and hypocritical. In regard to the fairness doctrine states that if person A obeys the law and doesn't cheat the system, shouldn't person B have the same obligation? Now, at face value, this seems rational. However, if you examine it closely, the fairness doctrine is invalid when obedience doesn't benefit any member of society or society at large. Now, this is the stoplight example. So imagine person B is at a stoplight at 12 o'clock midnight and no one's around. So person B runs this red light. Now, this is totally immaterial to the public good of society. Person A will never know that person B did this because it's of no harm to person A, and person B is not really getting any advantage from this act. So the act of obedience for certain immaterial acts, it's totally irrelevant, and I think that disproves the fairness doctrine. In regard to act utility, following an absolute obligation to obey the law necessitates a disregard for the utility of certain acts. If one assumes that the absolute obligation to obey the law is true, they're going to act based on legality, and they're going to use legality to justify their actions. And this creates a lot of inefficiency. If an act of disobedience is optimific,